See that, can't you? Now it says these religious parts, this is Kidder writing, these religious parts bear a distinctive character, that of cannibalism, which Smith was utterly unqualified to give them until after his connection with Rigdon. This shows that there were at least 3 parties to the real authorship, and we think it would be sheer injustice not to put Oliver Cowdery, the schoolmaster, upon as good literary footing as his more ambitious pupil, Joseph Smith Jr. That no copy of Spaulding's manuscript was available for inspection did no more to dampen enthusiasm for the theory than did such inconsistencies. After all, there seemed no alternative that was both realistic and palatable. The manuscript, devotees of the theory said, had been lost, or it had been destroyed, or it had been purchased by the Mormons and suppressed, a plot motif that is still very popular among certain critics today. Think of the Salt Lake Tribune, which I'm told disappeared into the First Presidency Vault about 2 weeks ago, and never be seen again. That Spaulding's manuscript was said to have contained a secular romance designed merely to entertain and perhaps to make a little money, was also dismissed as a trifle. Perhaps, said Rigdon, the Campbellite scriptorian, had been more than just a conveyor. It scarcely mattered. If it had to be so, it must have been so. Unfortunately for the advocates of the Spaulding theory, his manuscript story was recovered from a steamer trunk in Honolulu in 1884. It turned out to be a relatively short yarn, roughly 125 pages, about a group of Romans who set sail for Britain but were driven onto the coast of America by storms at sea. L.L. Rice, the rather surprised owner of the steamer trunk, remarked in the manuscript story in the Book of Mormon that, quote, there is no identity of names, of persons, or places, and there is no similarity of style between them. I should as soon think the Book of Revelation was written by the author of Don Quixote, as that the writer of this manuscript was the author of the Book of Mormon. Faithful adherents to the Spaulding theory now claim that this second work, Manuscript Found, was the real source of the Book of Mormon. Fortunately or unfortunately, though, it could not be examined, because nobody knew where it was, nor whether it ever was. Today, Fawn Brodie, though a devout disbeliever in the Book of Mormon and claims of Joseph Smith, effectively sounded the death knell of the Spaulding theory in a 1945 biography of the prophet entitled No Man Knows My History. She argued instead that Joseph Smith was the consciously fraudulent author of the book, which reflected his own personality and environment. The dull village idiot was now a myth-maker of prodigious talents. She was, of course, following more or less in the footsteps of Ida Woodbridge Riley, whose 1902 profile of the founder of Mormonism explained the Book of Mormon on the basis of a psychological analysis of Joseph Smith, who was, he said, subject to epileptic fits that somehow were supposed to account for his visions. But Brodie and most everybody else discounted the claim of epilepsy. The trail had also been blazed for her by Harry M. Beardsley's 1931 Joseph Smith and His Mormon Empire, in which Joseph was a paranoiac. In 1948, Reverend James Black also explained Joseph Smith as mentally ill, a dissociated personality. Thus, as F.W. Kirkham, surveying the scene in the early 1950s, Joseph Smith is first a money digger, then an ignoramus, then a deluded fanatic, then a vile deceiver, a fraud, then an epileptic, a paranoiac, then a myth-maker of prodigious talents. Finally, he is not an ignoramus, he is not a deceiver, rather a person with a dissociated personality. Kirkham predicted that in an age of greater ecumenism, and though he could not have used the phrase of political correctness, the hateful assaults on Joseph Smith that had been so acceptable in the 19th century would virtually disappear from favor among mainstream critics. The growing respectability of Mormonism would lead to a more civil, though no less determined, critique. And the collapse of the Spaulding theory would bring explanations full circle, back to Joseph Smith as sole or primary author of the Book of Mormon. The personality of Joseph Smith, he said, his learning, his environment, will be assumed and described by various writers to meet the requirements of his ability to produce the book and to organize the church. Historical facts that must be accepted in the actual writing and printing of the Book of Mormon will be interpreted by the coming writers to meet their various theses explaining the contents of the Book of Mormon. These writers will disagree concerning important assumed facts, but they will all deny the possibility of divine aid in the translation of the ancient record. Kirkham has been proven correct. Of course, some extreme anti-Mormons invoke demonic inspiration to account for it, but among serious writers, the pendulum has clearly swung back to Joseph Smith as the author. In his 1980 Mormon Answer to Skepticism, Why Joseph Smith Wrote the Book of Mormon, republished in 1992 by Signature Books to an overwhelming lack of demand, Robert Hollinger depicts Joseph as, quote, a defender of God, motivated by the noble desire to defend revealed religion against the inroads of deism. Gone is the once obvious fact that the author of the book was a Christianity-mocking atheist. Hollinger explicitly acknowledges that he's turning his back upon the theories of his own mentor, George Arbaugh, whose 1932 Revelation in Mormonism, published by the academically prestigious University of Chicago Press, had confidently divided the text of the Book of Mormon into portions written by either Solomon Spaulding, Sidney Rigdon, or Joseph Smith. John Brooke, in his immensely enjoyable Cambridge University Press book, The Refiner's Fire, presents a Joseph Smith who was a late exemplar of Renaissance Hermeticism and various occultic traditions. Jan Shipps, and at least the early Dan Vogel, emphasized Joseph's supposed fascination with explaining Indian mounts. Robert Anderson's Inside the Mind of Joseph Smith reads the Book of Mormon psychobiographically, claiming to see Joseph working out his own Freudian interior problems in the text. A similar approach is William Moraine's The Sword of Laban, Joseph Smith Jr. and the Dissociated Mind. The famous Yale literary critic Harold Bloom, failing to notice that Joseph Smith was nothing more than a typical blunderhead, calls him a religious genius and places him in the American pantheon alongside Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman. On the other hand, an anonymous critic of Joseph Smith, with whom I corresponded over the space of several months, posits an anonymous individual or group of considerable learning, familiar, for example, with rare maps of Inner Arabia, acquainted with Semitic languages, well-read in classical Arabic literature and jurisprudence, who somewhere, sometime, wrote the Book of Mormon for unknown motives, and then for some undiscoverable reason permitted Joseph Smith to publish it as his own. Bill Hamlin and I call this mysterious group the Illuminati, in honor of their remarkable capacity to be everywhere, to do and know everything, while remaining entirely invisible. One faction is still working a way to resurrect the Spaulding theory. The Venerable John L. Smith of Marlow, Oklahoma, continues to labor at a manuscript that will demonstrate Sidney Rigdon to be the real author of the Book of Mormon. I personally can hardly wait. The recent American Apocrypha further illustrates the apparent inability of Book of Mormon critics to agree on much of anything, except that the Book of Mormon is false. Only a few months ago, in fact, one of the editors of American Apocrypha explicitly, huffily, and repeatedly refused to answer a simple question as to whether Joseph Smith believed that he possessed metal plates or knew that he did not, which seems the kind of question that any skeptic's fundamental theory of Book of Mormon origins must answer sooner or later. He would not, he said, lower himself to thinking in such simple-minded categories. His approach is manifest in the book he edited. While the authors all seem to agree broadly that Joseph Smith was the sole or principal author of the Book of Mormon, there are notable disagreements about the how and the why. Edwin Firmage's essay, for example, depicts Joseph Smith as a rather cunning and deliberate fraud, making it all up on the fly, with major plot elements seemingly created on the basis of virtually sudden whims, resulting in serious inconsistencies in the book itself. Susan Staker also offers a Joseph Smith who creates the Book of Mormon rapidly, on the basis of swiftly mutating ideas whose evolution, driven by his own changing circumstances, is apparent within the text itself. George D. Smith partially seems to agree. He uses a highly debatable reading of B.H. Roberts to argue indirectly that Joseph drew upon Ethan Smith's view of the Hebrews in order to compose the Book of Mormon, a method that seems to demand more careful plotting than Firmage and Staker allow. David Wright, in what is by far the most academically rigorous essay in the book, likewise posits a careful and wholly conscious Joseph Smith, but one who in this instance bases at least a substantial part of his Book of Mormon on a close but misguided reading of King James Isaiah. Dan Vogel's second essay presents Joseph as composing an anti-Masonic text, a tract attuned to the controversy that ensued upon the murder of Captain William Morgan in 1826. He is every bit as confident in this assertion as Heber D. Howe was in his earlier explanation, according to which Solomon Spaulding, who died in 1816, was said by Howe, who heard it from Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, who claimed to have heard it from Spaulding's widow nearly 2 decades after Spaulding's death, that Spaulding didn't like Freemasonry. Howe concluded that this explains the Book of Mormon's references to Getty and Roberts and other secret combinations. All of these depictions of the Book of Mormon as a work of fiction directly collide with the testimony of the 3 and 8 witnesses. Accordingly, they must be destroyed. So in his first essay in American Apocrypha, although Dan Vogel grants their honesty, he seeks rather desperately, in my opinion, to explain the witnesses away. Their experiences were merely subjective, internal, hallucinatory. Joseph Smith was a hypnotist. A very fortunate one in the fact that although only a relatively small proportion of the general populace is susceptible to hypnosis, all of his witnesses were easy marks. But perhaps Vogel suggests Joseph also created some tin plates with which to dazzle the yokels. The invocation of this secondary prop may indicate that Vogel himself, to his credit, is not entirely persuaded by his subjective hallucination thesis. But once we've posited a previously unnoticed custom-designed metal foundry under Joseph's management, it also needs to produce the breastplate seen by various witnesses, as well as the brass plates, the Urim and Thummim, the Sword of Laban, and the Leah Homan. One wonders how many skilled metallurgists and craftsmen were available in the area at the time and what the local wage scale was. But then we read Scott Dunn's essay, according to which Joseph Smith created the Book of Mormon by a process of automatic writing. It just flowed out of him. Joseph was dissociative but sincere, and Dunn vigorously denies that conscious fraud was involved. In fact, the dictation process was probably scarcely conscious at all.